There we go. We are live.
We are live. Hello,
We are
Nick.
live. I'm Nick Harkaway.
Hey, I'm David McCloskey.
Hello, everyone. I have to give great kudos to Barnes& and Noble for just handing two authors the keys to the
Such
communication operators. It's
tremendous amount of
terrifying.
responsibility.
Anything could happen. I'm Nick Harkaway. I'm the author of Carla's Choice. There we go. We're just gonna, David, you're going to say the name of your book now.
That's right. I'm
There we
David
go.
McCloskey. I'm the author of The Seventh Floor.
There we go. And we're going to do a kind of little discussion of the books, and then you're going to do a reading.
I can. Were you planning on doing one? I have one marked
Because
out if you were
it
going to
says
do
we
one.
have a goof sheet,
It
right? And it
does.
says here consider doing a reading. So I have a short reading. What I would suggest is I introduce the book and do that, and then you do yours, and then we're off.
Love it. Let's do it.
Okay. So Carla's Choice, obviously, is a novel into my father's circus universe, the world of George Smiley. It takes place in the decade between, actually, it's 9 years between The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which we can get into the reasons behind that later. And as we begin, George Smiley has just been called back to the circus, which he hasn't been doing for a couple of months only. For Smiley, the experience of returning to the circus that evening was like a willed drowning. It was as if, as he climbed St. Martin's Lane in the direction of his old office, he were making his way down onto the plain of an abyssal sea. For the last months, he had lived in a daylight world, had espoused its meanings and attitudes, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of other men. He'd gone to Jermyn Street and bought a coat because it pleased him, rather than because it looked like every other coat on every other traveller. He had ordered memorably when eating out, and had asked for small alterations to suit his taste, the kind of things that are not troublesome, but are likely to be recalled by waiters in any subsequent inquiry, and thus also by the maitre d', and so attached to names and fellow diners. He had argued with taxi drivers, helped strangers with shopping, given directions, and in general allowed himself to be known and notable in the ordinary passages of life. He had, reciprocally, stopped paying attention to the minor and irrelevant doings of others, so that 10 days ago he could not have told you whether the man browsing in a bookshop in Cecil Court was interested in Ovid or Euclid or the history of English cricket, or merely killing time while he waited for an appointment. Now, as he approached the familiar door, he found that he was once again engaging in the exercise of paranoia which had governed his former life. Just a little taste.
I love that, by the way. That's a fantastic passage into the unchained, sort of the I guess unchaperoned world of Smiley and his brief period of freedom.
Brief moment where he's allowed to be happy.
That's right. That's right. Um, well, so my novel, The Seventh Floor, it's a mole hunt, which is of course a concept that will be familiar to probably almost everybody who has decided to log into this Zoom. It is a bit of an espionage whodunit. It's set in present day, sort of Langley. It is a question of this CIA case officer named Artemis Proctor, who readers have read my other books. She is the only kind of character who has recurred, and she is investigating a breach that has happened where one of her good friends has participated in an operation that's gone sideways. And it's become clear to her and to others at Langley, although not to the political leadership, that there is a Russian asset operating in the highest reaches of the agency. And so she, of course, investigates and comes up with this short list of suspects that is comprised of her sort of dearest friends and most cherished enemies. And they all have shared experiences together, one in particular in Afghanistan, which is what I'll sort of read the denouement of that as she's recollecting this experience to one of her good friends. And then I crawl along, she continued, still fixated on the plate. I scoot alongside Mac, my bum legs dragging like a bloody windsock, and I held him and said I was sorry for what I didn't even know. I told him he was an asshole for not painting anymore. I told him he was an asshole, and so was Theo for saving me and dying first, that your good friends deserve better. Don't leave me here, man. Just stay with me. I'm going to keep on talking until they find us or kill us or someone rescues us. Hold on. Can you hear me? God damn it. Your legs and back, man, they're not. It'll be fine. I know it. Fine. But you're a selfish prick, Mac. You know that, jumping in front of me like some moron angel. I can feel your pulse, man. Can you hear me? I'm going to keep talking. I'm just talking. I've got my forehead on yours and I'm talking. Think about Lulu. Think about me. Think about that night in Paris. Man, I hate Paris normally, sewer of a city, but that night, well, I'd go back for that. Maybe soon we go there. You'd paint one of your stupid paintings. Maybe a nude of Lulu. We'd all like that. That's 2 votes yes, me and you. Who cares what Lulu says? Mackie, you're there? Please don't. Please don't. Do not leave me here, man. You stay here with my voice, man. It's me, Artemis. If you see light, don't walk into it. Just turn around and walk back into the darkness. That's where I am.
Ooh, that's a passage and a half.
Oh, I was debating as I was reading it if there were any spoilers. I don't think there actually are.
But I mean, but it gets right to the heart of it, right? Because there's a really strong. It's one of the things that came up when I was talking to Sophia and Nguyen was the kind of one of the things about espionage fiction on either side of the Atlantic is that there's quite a strong sense of military kind of experience live now in the US context in a way that doesn't crop up so much in UK espionage stories.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. I think there's uh, I'm gonna forget who has actually coined this, but I've heard the description of basically Kalashnikov kids being the kind of tagline for
Wow.
it's part of there's a great group called Spybrary that has
Yeah.
sort of wonderful spy aficionados, and that's where I've heard it is this idea of in America the espionage fiction tends to be more techno thrillerish, right? And I think, look, I mean, the book, The Seventh Floor, is, I would consider it to be at least more pure espionage stuff, right? It actually has very little in it that's techno thrillery at all. But because it's trying that passage, I'm trying to deal realistically with the agency, the CIA of the last 25 years, and it's really hard to do that with a group of agency officers without talking about that war zone experience in
Yeah.
Iraq and Afghanistan. That's hard to exclude. It's just so embedded in the culture at this point.
Well, and I mean, and I think that's inevitable. And when I was doing, I mean, doing Carla's Choice into 1963, you know, again, it's canonical from the stories that I receive, from my dad at that point. That a lot of these guys have wartime experience of wartime
Yeah.
spying, but kind of hot war spying is a whole other thing, and it's something that he didn't really write about. Honorable Schoolboy has some hot war spying in it, but we know from Tinker Tailor, we know that George Smiley spent some time. In Germany during the Second World War doing something, but we don't really know
Yeah.
what. And Smiley obviously kind of archetypically is not that guy. Like there's actually a moment in Tinker Tailor where he picks up a handgun and looks at it and thinks that if he shoots anybody, there'll just be a terrible row, and he puts it down. And he's kind of, and that's almost definitive for me of the difference between these two kinds of stories that in my dad's books, and perforce in Carla's Choice, although people have guns and violence is potentially instantaneous and sudden, and it precipitates out of kind of grayness and it comes unexpectedly, and it can be absolute. In Smiley's People, General Vladimir just gets shot in the face, just bang, and that's it, done. But in the day to day, guns are still very much something that are off the table. They're kind of
Yeah.
and it's very much a kind of, all right, what can we do in espionage terms without a violent confrontation? And actually, I mean, I am so far removed from the intelligence services. I think just that nobody would ever have recruited me anyway. But if they ever even thought about it, they kind of looked at my dad and they went, "We tried that, and that was not a good scene. Like that did not go in the direction that we wanted it to go." And he actually said about himself, because he was briefly in charge of vetting new applicants to SIS, and he did say, he was like, if they had actually put my CV across my desk, I would have gone like, nope, absolutely
Rejected.
under no circumstances should this guy be anywhere near this profession. But do you have a sense? Because I mean, one of the things that I'm working into is this sense of these slightly broken people who have kind of problems of their own, as it were. And one of the things that some of them are looking for, quite a lot of them are looking for, is some kind of structure in which to vest their faith. There need to be kind of, is that something, that's familiar to you? Because you, I think, are a little bit more familiar with the real version of this than I am.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the way I'd put it slightly differently, which would be, I think most of the analysts and case officers and others who spend any considerable amount of time in the service have a strong desire to uphold, and even if at times what they feel like they're doing is totally disconnected from it, but to uphold a mission that is bigger than themselves. So in that sense, I think there's some article of faith in the work, right? That the day-to-day of what you're doing is going to be connected to something that is bigger than you. It's bigger than corporate profit, on and on, right? So, but I think, literally the epigraph for my book is the building doesn't love you back.
Yeah.
The reality after 10, 20, 30 years in, you leave, you realize that the place moves on, the mission moves on without you. And so you sort of, I think, are a lot of the characters in the book, I mean, and frankly, it's just the lived experience of a lot of case officers that I know, are kind of coming to terms with this reality of like, what does it mean to be loyal to a place that just maybe doesn't care about you, really? I mean, I honestly, when I was reading Carla's Choice, I was struck by this too, because you could ask the same question to Smiley, right? What do you owe this place that he's happy in the passage you just read? He gets to order all kinds of interesting things at restaurants, exactly, and buy fun coats, and now he's kind of pulled back in.
He wants the chicken without the special sauce. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, for Smiley, I think the question is how he believes in the cause, if not the institution. And so he wants, how can he execute the assignment, the cause, in such a way that it's still worth doing when you get to the far end? That's always the struggle when as you get into the Tinker Tailor trilogy and so on. Increasingly, the question is, if we do these things, do we still deserve to win? And so what you have with Karla's Choice is a very early rush of Smiley asking that question in the aftermath of everything that's happened in The Spy Who Came from the Cold, which very deliberately, you don't have to read Spy Who Came from the Cold before you read Karla's Choice, but the idea is that you could go from Karla's Choice either backwards or forwards. He's asking himself, what am I doing here? And I guess it's the question. It's also the question that my dad essentially was asking Dr. August Hanning, who was then a senior member of the German security department during the war on terror. Was where are the boundaries? What can you not do and still consider yourself the good guy? And they had a correspondence which is sort of in the book of my dad's letters, which, I mean, I'm impressed by, because that is asking the question to somebody who can do something about the answer.
Yeah.
But for Smiley, definitely, what do I owe to other people just by dint of the fact that we're all human beings? What can I do? Is kind of the question that sort of mitigates his espionage, even when sometimes he should maybe be more ruthless. He's asking himself that question.
Yeah. Well, how did you? I'm kind of dying to know, because I read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, I think when I was probably 12 or something like that, and pretty quickly thereafter was hooked. And you kind of, I know there was this kind of quote unquote missing decade in there, right? I am just kind of curious for the origin story on this, because it's fascinating to me. I reflected on this after reading that it was sort of like the installment that I didn't know that I needed in many ways.
So, I mean, the first thing is he intended to write more Smiley novels. Like, it was always a notion. And then Guinness came along and he played Smiley so well, and he kind of Dad lost track of the Smiley character in his head because all he could do was hear Guinness. And he had to kind of make peace with that to write Smiley's people. But so the notion was that you would have Smiley versus Karla across the arenas of the world. And the thing is that when we hear about Karla for the first time in Tinker Tailor, Smiley's met him in 1955, and then he doesn't crop up in The Spy Who Came From the Cold. But when they meet in 1955, he's not anybody in particular. Smiley doesn't say, "Oh my God, it's Karla." He's like, "Oh yeah, this is some guy who's washed up." And when the meeting doesn't go well and Karla doesn't want to defect, everybody's reaction is, "Oh well, that's fine. Throw him back. They'll probably shoot him, but whatever." So it's only sometime in that decade that Smiley and Karla come to be nemesis to one another. And Karla then later says that Smiley's the only threat to his operations, and Smiley pursues Karla and can never get him, and so on. And so this is the decade where that happens, among all the other things that happen in the 60s and the Cold War. And in the Le Carre continuity, there's a lot going on in the 60s. But so this is the space where that happens, which is, so you're building to Tinker Tailor where it all comes tumbling down, and to Smiley's People where the Cold War comes to an end. You're leaving behind Spy Going from the Cold, and you have these 9 narrative years into which to work, where you can tell a story that belongs exclusively to itself. Like, it ties into the continuity, but it has enough elbow room to be its own thing, which to me was kind of, working into this existing universe. I had to be able to tell stories which matter on their own terms.
Yeah.
And so that period is a gift. Also, the other thing that's a gift is that the continuity is very foggy. There's like fog of espionage, because
which is very helpful for a novelist, by the way. Yes, you really want that.
You definitely want that.
Yeah.
And so, like, we know that sometime in the early 60s, Percy Alleline, actually, in order to impress his American counterparts, gets involved in toppling a friendly regime in the Middle East, and it doesn't go well, and he gets sent home in disgrace. Now, whether or not that's a story I want to tell, that's in there somewhere. And then Alleline comes back, and he ends up as the boss of the circus a few years later. So there's so we have all these things that are happening around us, and yet there is room, because we don't know where anybody is at any given time. We have room to kind of, ask ourselves what's going on in a way that, is interesting, rather than just kind of paint by numbers.
Yeah, that's a good point on the continuity, but also the kind of elbow room to make it its own story. Because if it fits too tightly in, and you have to start one place or another, I imagine it's hard. It's a harder story to step into, right?
I think it's just difficult. I mean, you're stuck with delivering an outcome everybody already knows. When you start this book, you don't know what's going to happen at the end. There's no information in the existing canon about this incident. Which means
that's right.
That you have freedom to tell, like I say, a story that belongs to itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you find, because you've done more books into this series than I have ever done into books that follow on from one another, so you must be to some extent familiar with kind of like, what did I do last time? Like, oh God, did I close down the avenue I want to explore right now?
A little bit, although I will say, I, for whatever reason, it's not some kind of allergy to these types of books. I just didn't want to write a, Jack Ryan 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of a thing. So the books are kind of a universe, but it's not a proper series, I would say. So there does have to be they have to be logically consistent and chronologically consistent with one another. But I don't even think I realized that this was going to be useful to me as a writer as I was starting, but it was I only have a couple characters who I really have to track all that closely at this point. And so this Artemis Proctor woman, who's the, sort of kind of mole hunter in the 7th Floor, she's recurring across the 3 and kind of has a bigger role. And I think, intrepid readers may notice a couple minor inconsistencies in chronology and timeline that this novelist was aware of, but unable to iron out effectively.
We're allowed those. We're allowed a few of them.
Yeah, it's a fictional world, come on.
Also, they're spies. They lie a lot.
Exactly. Who's to say that? That's a good. I'm going to use that line later. She was lying in the first book about
lying in book 1
about how old she was.
But that is, geez, George Smiley lies about his age. I mean, actually, my dad lies about his age consistently. He goes through a kind of perpetual being in his mid-50s, and then suddenly he's retired and he's older. But yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that happens with the Smiley novels is that you have the Cold War as the background, and it obeys roughly the same arc in terms of intensity and so on. But none of the kind of key events are particularly mentioned. Like, we don't talk about the secret speech or the Cuban Missile Crisis. We just think tensions have been high. And that's all there is, and so you have this kind of permanent paranoid ambience or ambient paranoia, where none of the tentpole events which made everybody paranoid are referenced. You just have a
Mhm.
permanent, undifferentiated fog of paranoia, which again is very useful. He wasn't building a franchise. So Tinker Tailor to Honorable Schoolboy, he just adjusts the years everything happened by 12 months. You're like, why not?
That resonates with me as a writer too. I'm, I, I think it's, I do think if you're hoping that somebody somewhere 30 years from now will pick up your book and won't immediately feel a sense of it being dated, if you
Yeah.
can balance that, if you can be specific enough to bring the reader into the world and vague enough so that they're not able to pinpoint the precise year this is happening, that's useful, I
See,
think.
well, so here's the weird thing for me, right? Is that that is absolutely what he was doing in 1962, 63, writing his books, whatever, through to the 70s. But of course, I'm writing a piece of historical fiction, so everybody knows exactly when it's set,
Okay.
which is odd. I've never done historical fiction really. And one of the things I had to do was kind of step into this space and use all the kind of world building that I would normally use to kind of describe something completely wild, to create a time period. But actually, it's not really a time period because we're not going to 1963, we're going to the circus brackets
Yeah.
1963. And it's the circus we're interested in, so I don't need to get into a long, drawn out description of Van der Rohe furniture, but I do need you to believe that this is what the circus was at that moment, and I need it to feel right. Tonal consistency, voice consistency is more important than
That's right.
continuity consistency, which is
That's right.
kind of fog of espionage thing again. How are we doing? We're approaching that moment when we can throw this open and get people to ask us questions. What do you
Well,
reckon?
I'm gonna ask you, I think
Okay.
we can, but I do want to ask you this, which is, did you did the story, and I think one of our intrepid participants had suggested this question also, was did you have an idea and did that idea change over time, or did you, I mean, I know obviously it did to some degree as you wrote, but I'm curious if you kind of had it more or less baked out and versus it kind of appearing to you as you went forward with the drafting.
So I started kind of from the point of view that I was going to write into this period, and that it was going to be an independent story, so it didn't want to be anything that was already referenced. I wanted us to
Yeah.
feel, we're in clear water. And there were a couple of kind of fun stories from the real world that Dad used to tell. And this was one of them, that once upon a time a KGB hitman turned up on a doorstep and said, "Hello, I'm here to assassinate your husband." And the lady of the house said, "Well, in that case, you better come inside." And we may assume that she had realized by this declaration that he wasn't going to assassinate her husband, because so that he comes inside and he duly defects. And this is, kind of, but just this great moment of kind of, well, I guess you better come in, and that was so. So I had that story in the back of my head, and so the very beginning of this book, the inciting incident, is Mickey Bortnick turning up and saying, "I'm here to assassinate your boss, but I've changed my mind." So I had that as my jumping off point. And then for me, very often with writing, it's a question of pushing the stone up to the top of the hill and then letting it go.
Mm.
And if you've kind of pointed it in roughly the right direction, the energy is, you can trust that you'll find the twists and turns as you go. Like for example, I didn't know I was going to bring Peter Gwilym in Berlin until like I realized we were going to Berlin, and I was like, we're going to have Gwilym. That's great, because I wasn't sure. I didn't
Mm.
want to start with Gwilym and Smiley because it felt to me like that was the very clear kind of Holmes and Watson duo, and I
Yeah.
wanted to be a little bit further away from that because I think obviously one of the risks that I had to deal with was pastiche, or kind of trying to do something that was kind of too obviously in the mold of, and so you make it a little bit more difficult. And then when you get to Berlin, you're kind of like, oh, this is great, here's Gwilym, and the relationship is still kind of recognizably that relationship.
You didn't want it to feel like the sort of, gathering the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the first two pages of
No,
the
no,
story,
exactly,
right?
exactly. It's
Yeah.
not Avengers Assemble. Well, and I mean, it's also it's the Le Carre universe, so it's kind of sort of the Avengers all hate each other, and they'd rather be kind of
Yeah,
somewhere else.
they don't always get along. That's right.
And they don't get along, and they disapprove of one another on fundamental levels, and kind of, yeah. I mean, it's that kind of sense of disaffection, and yet they're sort of bonded by trauma.
That's a good way to put it. Because the other kind of inside baseball thing I just wanted to ask you was, I felt when I picked the book up like some amount of, as I'm sure you did, writing it by orders of magnitude beyond this, that I was going to read a line from Smiley, Gwillem, somebody, and was going to say, that's not them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
But it was remarkable. I honestly, it was remarkable that the voice, it was incredible. It really was.
So the thing about that's really important to me is that when I was born in 1972, and my dad was writing the Smiley novels through the 70s as I grew up. And he would be writing in the early morning before I woke up. He'd come to the breakfast table with new handwritten pages, or with typed up pages that my mother had typed up, and he would read them across the table to her. And incidentally, if they wanted to do cut and paste, they took a pair of scissors and they cut the pages, and then they would staple them onto the next page. That was, cut and paste was very literal. But so he would read to her, an hour, 90 minutes, they'd have that conversation, and I'd be there listening. So as I was acquiring language, I was listening to George Smiley for like my young sort of life. And so when I came to write this book, I sat down, and my family said, kind of, will you do this? And I sort of said, yes. And when I came to start doing little pieces of paragraphs of stuff to see whether I could do it, I didn't have to turn the dial very far on the way that I write to find a voice that is absolutely authentically mine, but reads to you as a Le Carre voice or a circus voice. And so it's kind of cheating. If everybody kind of is going like, well, this is extraordinary ventriloquism or extraordinary channeling, and it's really not. It's just that, of course, when you think about it, this would be the case, that I am so immersed just on some kind of almost neurological level,
exactly.
that it's very close to the surface in me. And when you strip away my desire to bang three genres together, blow them up, and make a new monster, and kind of, which is what I normally do, and just say, okay, we're coloring inside the lines today, you very quickly get something that reads circus ready.
Yeah, I mean, I guess how could it be otherwise, right? If that was your breakfast table.
And this is the thing, right?
Yeah.
It on the one hand, that's extraordinary, and on the other hand, it's inevitable. And I find both of those things kind of weird.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, my experiences with kind of growing up writing, my father's a writer, not fiction. I never had exposure like that to his prose and syntax and way of thinking about how he wrote. And I wonder, I'm sure my writing, my voice would be much similar to his today if I had been marinating in it at the breakfast table. Do we have any questions coming in here? I know we've got some others.
We've got some good ones here. Should we do, because this one always comes up, and I think it's always interesting. So we have, hang on, what is your writing process? Mira wants to know, what's your writing process? You tell me what's yours.
So I have 3 small children who are delightful and horrible all at once, and who are decidedly not helpful for the production of creative fiction yet, despite the book being dedicated to them. So I have to have long periods of time where I am locked away in an office or at a coffee shop with the same song on repeat, which are kind of my 2 typical writing speeds. I try, when I am writing a first draft, I try to do somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 words a day.
Yeah.
anything less than that is a failure. Anything more is great, but it also doesn't get tallied into the next day. So if I write
No,
3,000
no,
one
no.
day, the next day
Yeah,
I
no,
don't get to write 500 and
no,
call
no,
it
sure. If you do
good.
3,500 in a day, you're still back to doing 2,000 the
You're
following day.
still back. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And it's really it's really kind of like clocking in and clocking out.
Yeah.
For me, I have my butt in the chair by 8:30 after kids are at school, and typically I get up at about 4:30 or 5
Oh
and
my God.
go
In
back
the
and do
morning,
dinner.
not the
Oh,
afternoon.
oh no. Yeah, no, 8:30 a.m.
Oh,
to 4:30 or 5 p.m.
oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry,
normal
just for a
day,
second there.
normal day.
I had a vision of you getting up at 4:30 in the morning, kind of running 10K and then kind of like, maybe doing something improving.
I do exercise in the morning, so I'm up at 5, and because there's just no margin with 3 little kids. There's absolutely no margin,
Well,
and
I only have two, but I get the picture. None I think you're probably just fitter than I am.
and I'll tell you that if I was reading stuff at the breakfast table, my wife would poison my oatmeal. So the breakfast
Right, but that
discussion is
doesn't,
very
yeah.
much not book related, and that's kind of it. And you know what, I try to get the first draft done very quickly, and I know it's going to be absolutely atrocious, and I don't show it to anybody, but I try to get that story down in
Yeah.
its I guess what I call it is like I'm not cooking the meal or even a bad version of the meal. I'm literally putting the ingredients or a bunch of ingredients on the table. And then after I have that thing, which is 130,000 words of, stuff, I'll then figure out over the next 7, 8, 9 drafts what the book actually is. So for me, it's a race initially
Right.
to kind of get that draft down.
Yeah.
How do you do it, or what's your
I mean,
writing approach?
in many ways, quite similar. I mean, it's interesting that you say 1,500 to 2,000 words. That's also my kind of target zone, and I also get very happy when I exceed it. I'm a little bit kinder to myself about 400 words not being failure. It's like sometimes you have to have an off day in order to find out that you did something wrong or whatever. One of the virtues of writing at that speed is that if something does go wrong, you're only ever, 5 days from fixing it.
That's
Which is
true. That's a good point.
great. No, but yeah, I mean, my kids are 14 and 11 now, and but I did also, so I started out as a screenwriter, which I was notably bad at, and one of the disciplines of that is that you theoretically, although I never had to do it, you have to write on set. And so I very
Mm.
firmly told myself that I was going to be able to write anywhere under any circumstances. And lots of my previous books have been written in chunks on iPhones on trains and planes. Um, and so I make a very kind of firm, kind of like, it has to be that way. And I mean, I actually share an office with my wife, who now runs the John and Carey Limited, the estate company. And so I can hear her kind of arguing with lawyers on the other desk. Sometimes I put headphones on because I need to kind of get into it, but broadly speaking, I've just made myself sort of function in clatter. And I edited one of my books in the hospital just after my wife had given birth to our first child. So we were all there kind of while she slept and our baby slept. I was kind of sitting there doing that because I had a deadline and so on. Which is very kind of it felt very wholesome to me at the time. I was kind of sitting there with like my stack of papers, and I could put them down and help and do all the kind of necessary stuff while Claire was asleep and so on. Anyway, um, but
Oh,
yeah,
here's
so the process is very similar to what you describe. Actually, you write it and then you fix it.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a certain amount of discovery in the writing. I like to have a bit of a plan. I talked about pushing the stone up to the top of the hill. Part of that process of pushing it up there is kind of knowing, broadly speaking, what the universe is and how it works, and a target zone. Like I want the boulder to go down the hill. I want it to land in that field. I don't want it to crush any of those people, but that guy's fair game. Um, and then it's a kind of follow the ride. And usually there'll be a moment where someone does something that I don't want them to. Um, you
Yeah.
know, and generally, with my first ever book, I did not want to tell the war story section. I had a section where everybody goes into this And I was just like, this is just not, I have no
Mm.
relevant experience. This is fraudulent. And I could not finish the book. I could not. And then I kind of, okay, we'll have to do this. And I found every book on the subjective experience of recent modern conflict that I could. And I was like, okay, so it's just nuts and everything sucks and everyone thinks it's crazy. Fine, I can do that. And so the idea was that the depiction of war should be not risible. I don't care if it's wrong, that's fine. But if you've been in a foxhole somewhere with bullets flying over your head, I don't want you sitting there going, well, this guy has no idea, and he kind of what he thinks is stupid and offensive. Like that's not the gig. So and it's always like that. Sometimes the book takes you somewhere you don't want to go, and that's usually the place where you do your best writing.
I have also found that you can develop enough confidence, or at least I'll frame it as me. I feel like I can develop enough confidence to write something I know almost nothing about. If I can just have a couple conversations with people who know a great deal about it and who are willing to spend a little bit of time with me to kind of talk, like I'll put 10 what ifs to them, ask and it's not the full answer. It doesn't get you all the way there, but it's a
As long as as
huge
long as you
part.
can as long as you can draw the lines out and move over the thin ice quite quickly, it's
Yeah,
fine. But then they call you out on it. People call you and they go, you wrote this great thing about cognitive security. Will you come and address our conference? And you're sitting there like, no,
absolutely not.
under no circumstances. You know who you should talk to? You should talk to this guy. You know, but yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, I love that facility and I love doing that. On the other hand, I'm also very wary of it for exactly that reason. Like, a lot of this stuff, when you go somewhere you don't know, you want to be very, very careful to make sure that what you're doing is sort of still okay with everybody. But yes, you're absolutely right. There is that business of persuading people that you understand things that you have no contact with, to the extent at least that they can fill in the blanks from their own experience.
That's right. Well, there's a
Oh,
question here about you nailed, which I agree with, Toby Esterhazy's not quite perfect English. This is a question from Jordan Lloyd. Said, how much did you enjoy writing Toby?
oh my God, so much. So much. Toby's the most fun. Because he's the guy who's enjoying all this. Everybody else is basically in hell for some part of their time in the circus, but Toby Esterhazy is like, this is fantastic. I get to lie to people and call it virtue. You know, um, and no, I mean Toby's great. And also one of the things I can do in the book is spend a little time doing a little bit more with the characters that we love, showing a little bit more of them. Every time I do that, though, it has to be like the warehouse in Raiders of the Lost Ark. When you put the ark in the thing, and you can see the pools of light going off into the distance, and there's 10,000 boxes in here full of stuff you want to know about. So now that you know the ark is down there, and you know a little bit about the ark, you're like, what about all these other things? So every time you reveal something about one of these characters, it just has to awaken a hunger which will never be satisfied to know more. And the more you know, particularly about Karla, right? Because you can't really know Karla. He has to be imponderable. He has to be the human face of the wall, or the wall has to be the abstracted version of Karla. Like, uh,
Mm.
he's the authoritarian regime made flesh. So the more you know about him, the more you have to feel you still don't understand. And that's the rule, kind of. He has to go beyond
Mm.
all the time. But Toby's, and Toby in a way is different from that because you want to know him, but you also, like, I get to hint at Toby's recruitment, which again, Smiley recruits Toby in a squat in Vienna. That's all we know. But now, who was he? Why was he in the squat? We get a little sense of like Toby was living quite a dangerous life.
I have a few scenes in the seventh floor where Proctor is speaking with a resettled Russian who had worked for us in Moscow and is then chosen to make his new life in that most American of towns, Las Vegas. And he's living under the identity of Frankie Potnick, and he's got a very bizarre accent, of course, to everyone around him. And I will say, writing a kind of imperfect American accent for a Russian was a ton of fun. It was a ton of fun because you can play with the language in a way that you really can't with a native speaker, but you can also understand it as you read it. It's very, yeah, I found it very satisfying to
But
do,
it's
I
also,
must
again,
say.
you've got a very similar thing actually with that guy. He is unrepentantly enjoying his life.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
know,
He's a total
he's
degenerate and he loves it.
yeah.
He's killing
He's like, yeah,
himself
no,
daily. Yeah.
I really like being this degenerate character, and that's also great fun, you know. And so that feels, you know, so yeah, when you're writing, particularly when you're writing something which has quite a dark spine to it, you know, kind of quite a lot of shadows and sorrow. You know, having somebody like that come across the page and just kind of go, yeah, and alternatively, you could just say to hell with it and have fun, you know, is quite a relief. And then, you know, and you kind of, it's actually very useful in terms of building that sorrow as well, because there you have somebody who is a kind of template for what you would have to become if you were going to be happy. And you've got these characters over here who are maybe a bit more virtuous, and there's no way they can do that. You know,
Right.
that's beyond them. They can't make that leap into being kind of unreconstructed and happy about it.
Much as they might enjoy
Much
it.
as they might kind of
Um,
weirdly envy it, they also can't just
yes.
go there.
Well, I guess we're nearing that point where this question from Tyler about what's next could make sense. Do you have a what's next for you or what's next for
I had
the
such a
circus?
I had such a good answer for this last week. Last week, I was saying, well, you know, it very much depends on how publication goes, and you know, but I'd love to write another one, but I don't really know what's going to happen. And then over the weekend here in the UK, it was like a superhero landing. Everything, all the reviews came out at once, and now I have to concede that it may be going quite well. So I can no
That is
longer.
a dangerous thing for an author to say. We
Well,
should,
but I can no longer. Well, the thing
it
is,
is.
it may be going quite well is good enough as a, you know, the trouble is that what it definitely does is it puts me back in the hot seat to answer that question. So
Yes.
I have notes towards another story. I have not yet been formally asked to do another one, but you know, as I say, like it's looking a little unrealistic since the weekend to say no, I won't be doing another one.
Just hang it up. That's right.
It seems basically, you know, the thing is, we have being serious for a second. We have a very obvious hurdle with this book, which is that um, you pick it up and you go, can't quite believe you had the sheer hubris to do this. Let's see what you got, right? And that's my ideal reader. That person who's kind of gone, you are clearly a lunatic daring to do this, but I will see whether you have done it, is my perfect person, because that's all I can ask from anybody. The you know, but so what we have to do is get people to the point where they will pick it up, as opposed to going, that's just never going to work.
Hmm.
And you know, and what's becoming clear here now, I don't know how it's working out in the States, but you know, is that you know, there's enough weight behind the idea that it works well enough that you've got to have a look and see what you think, you know.
Mm.
And so that hurdle is, if not cleared, at least much less threatening to me now, which incidentally has made me infinitely more terrified about the whole thing. Like the sheer weight
That's how
of
you know
terror.
that's how you know you're a writer. You've got the right mix of my every day for me is like a three-legged stool of fear, joy, and self-loathing. And they
There
all
it is.
happen. They all happen. It's just the mix that
We're gonna have
changes, you
t-shirts
know.
made with the three-legged stool. What was it? Fear, self-loathing,
Fear,
joy,
fear, joy, and self-loathing.
fear, joy,
Yeah.
and self-loathing. The three-legged stool of the writer. That is
Yes.
absolutely excellent. It's the milking stool of writing.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Wow.
And yeah, so I mean, I'm going to guess that over the course of the weekend, with all these wonderful reviews coming in, you absorbed them, and then you went somewhere else for an hour, and maybe you started to write something, and then you experienced like the self-loathing, and you know, so it's constant. It's like it is the only thing that holds the writer up, in
I
my
actually
experience.
just I didn't even get to the point where I was trying to write something. I was actually just sitting there with my mouth open going, and, which is my very sophisticated writer face. And I'm still kind of there. I haven't really got my head around um people saying yes to this. Like obviously the whole point of the exercise was that everybody would say yes. And now they seemingly are, and that's very confusing. And it's
Yeah.
emotionally more confusing. Writing the book was obviously a big kind of emotional thing, you know, because it's into my dad's universe and so on. And it was very kind of full on, but I hadn't really thought about how it would be when people started saying, yes, you were successful, which is very moving, you know. So it's a wild thing.
Let's see here.
Here we go. There's a good one here. Joanne Franklin says, did this story change from the original idea? Seventh floor. Did it change as you went along?
Yes, although you made the comment about boulder uphill, I want to roll it down into this field. I would argue like the field didn't change, but I knew I wanted to do a mole hunt story. I knew that Proctor would be the chief mole hunter. I knew she would have some friends with her. All of that remained consistent. But, I mean, as you, of course, would know, Nick, all of everything important changed over the course of the writing. Like the emotional tenor of her relationships with her friends. I had a conception of what that would be up front. That totally changed. There were plot elements that I got to a point. I mean, as what I have generally tried in my stories to be as authentic as I can to the CIA, good, bad, ugly, and to the way intelligence operations and intelligence bureaucracy actually function. And the reality of a mole hunt story is that it's slow, as you will, of course, be well aware. It is a lot of looking at reports, matrices, talking to people. And I don't know what it says about me. I'm sure the psychologists at some point will have a field day with this. I have yet to write a book where in the tail third, someone doesn't murder a close friend or family member. And I wanted that to happen in this book. I won't give away who was murdered. And I didn't have, as I was writing, there were elements of the mole hunt that I quite liked, and it wasn't kinetic enough for me. And so I injected a fairly psychotic team of Russian illegals, a husband and wife duo who have sort of self-recruited themselves and brought them into the story. And so that element was totally, I had not intended on that. It sort of wasn't, I was imagining it initially as kind of, okay, it's going to be more slower kind of bureaucratic thing. And I just didn't work. And so I put them in and they took the wheel.
Terrifying. They're genuinely terrifying.
Yeah, because they play on, and look, I think, it's an interesting feature of psychological suspense, but it's embedded, I think, in particular in espionage stories, and in particular stories about traitors, where you get this sense of, I don't know the people around me. I really don't know them at all. I know so much about them and maybe the least important parts. And it gets down to this idea of like, well, do you know your neighbor? Do you know your husband? I mean, there's something very elemental about that I think in these types of stories you can really play around with. And with those Russians, they're in Dallas. I basically put them in the neighborhood that my wife and I live in. Nice. They behave like the worst behaved of our and most stereotypical Dallasites around us and doing all these horrible Dallas things. And but you kind of don't know who they are. They're actually working for Russia. So it was a way to kind of play around with this idea that how much can you really know about the people around you, which I think is evergreen in the genre.
I definitely want to know that my neighbors are not those two. Those guys are terrifying.
Yeah, you'd like some proof to the contrary.
I would really need to be reassured about that. Although I actually live next door to a funeral parlor, so there's a whole kind of there's always the question of like kind of who are the people working next door? What are they like? All I know about them really is that they're always really pleased to see us because we're the only people they deal with in a working day who are not crying. So we are the kind of so they we pop round, say hi, no, but I mean that's always a kind of weird mystery of what's on the other side of actually just behind my computer is their office, just on the other side of the wall.
Well, there's probably a novel there somewhere, right?
Yeah, but probably not one of mine, to be truthful.
Not one of you or someone else. Someone else. That's right.
Here we go. What's the best advice you've ever received? Jessica DeLillo wants to know. That's like a life question. I feel
Is that a
unequal.
life question? Yeah.
Maybe it's the best writing advice. Let's assume it's the best writing advice.
Okay, that's maybe easier to answer. My answer to this, which I'm going to stick with, even though I find it to be um, maybe obvious, is, and maybe it's life advice too. Make it broader, little self-help lesson here for everybody. I think almost nothing of consequence in life and writing happens all at once and in massive bites. Like it is showing up consistently and doing small things all the time, some of which work, some of which don't, but continuing to kind of show back up day in and day out,
Yeah.
to put effort into a book, into a marriage, into your kids, into mastering a craft, a sport, whatever it might be. Like,
There we go. Now we got to life advice into the
there you
book.
go. So I think, but that's honestly, and it's being obsessive about it, I think too, like refusing to let the okay graph or the chapter that sort of gets done what you need it to get done, but maybe not all the way. Like, don't let it
Oh
sit
my
there.
God.
You just keep coming
Here's a
back to it.
terrifying thing. PG Woodhouse allegedly had a pinboard, and he had it divided into grades, and he would pin up the book as he was writing it on the thing, and it like the bad pages would go at the bottom, and the good ones would go at the top, and all of them had to move up to the top before the book was finished. And I still don't have I don't have the kind of the bravery for that one. That would be terrifying.
Well, and I it can be hard later in the process, as you get down the path on a book too, I think, to discern where those pages actually should
That's
go.
true. You get snowblind as well. That is true.
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
so I will share something that is simultaneously incredibly useful and incredibly irritating that my dad used to say about writing. The cat sat on the mat is not a story, but the cat sat on the dog's mat is the beginning of
Yeah,
something.
that's
Which
right.
I know. I mean, it's one of those things. Actually, the business of carrying the stone to the top of the hill is finding the dog. It's
Yeah,
once you've got that, and I think that's simultaneously the most useful and the most kind of broadly generalized piece of writing advice ever. So it's either useful or useless depending on the day you come to it.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. It's I have found that it has not been possible to find the dog until I've nearly written the book, maybe 3 or 4 times. Uh,
Yeah, I think yes. So well, and but it's also useful in the micro. Sometimes I mean I will I mean this is actually back to the kind of PG Woodhouse thing. I will go through my scenes and ask myself kind of, all right, what's the entry point, what's the low point, what's the high
yeah,
point? Each individual scene has its own little heroic narrative going on. And I guess, to follow the metaphor, each scene's got to have a dog's mat in it in one way or another, even if it's very subtextual and very quiet. And that's actually quite a good
mm,
editing criterion. Like if the scene has no dog, it's got to go.
it's got to go. That's right. That's right. And I have found, at least, that upon the first maybe 2, 3 drafts, I cannot tell you, or I'm not even focused enough on the story to be able to really go into that level and say, here is the dog in this scene.
Because
Because
it really comes
yeah,
lamination, layer
that's
upon
right.
layer upon
That's
layer.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
This is the good stuff. We're approaching the hour. Do we
I know.
should we do one more and then
I think we do one more. Somehow these two authors have managed to navigate the organizational complexities of the full
yeah,
hour untethered. I mean,
the plane has not landed yet. Don't
no, that's true. There's a minute to go. The landing's the most
there's
important
time
part. The
yet.
stick, the second most, maybe.
What have we got here? You pick one.
Okay. Okay. How do you balance the need or desire to get historical or technical details right, with the desire for creative license? And maybe a second point, which you could take this one too, is when do you stop researching and start writing, or how do you manage that piece of it?
So the research process is very interesting for me in that very often the point of it, I go in there wanting to know like what car would they be driving. And I come out of it knowing that actually the issue isn't what the car would be, but let's say the distance between petrol stations is so great that actually, there's a problem there where they, somehow what you find out, which is peripheral to what you originally want to know, is more important than the original question. So,
Mm.
and I mean, as to how much I balance things, I mean, because I'm creating the world of the circus here, rather than if I was writing a historical novel set in the 1960s, I would be kind of somewhat obsessive about trying to get details, not all of them, but enough of them to pick them out and make you believe that you can fill in the rest. With this, I needed to be in the circus primarily, and then markers of what's going on outside the circus are also important. So there is, some of the decor is right, some of the cars are all right. There's a moment in the history of London's public transport system where radio taxis were briefly a thing, and then they were called minicabs, and they were a thing, and then they were outlawed because they were said to be touting for hire, which is a whole thing that only licensed cabs are allowed to do, blah, blah, blah. And there's a brief reference to that, which, if you're somebody who cares about historical detail, you will immediately clock, and it locks it to the 60s. But I'm not, I want tiny totemic things of the 60s.
Yeah.
So I got into what cigarettes did they smoke in Eastern Europe and where did they come from? The answer is the Bulgarian tobacco trade was a huge deal. And immediately what I find out is that there's probably a whole book in economic espionage and infrastructure espionage around tobacco right? Because you're transporting it all around inside the Iron Curtain. So inevitably it's a supply chain. You can compromise it. You can move whatever you want to move around the Soviet alliance. So it's stuff like that. And when do I start writing? Almost immediately. Particularly if something inspires me, because it's super interesting. I'll write that sequence, then I'll go back and do some more. I end up with piles and hundreds of photographs of books, single pages of books with kind of like it piled into various note-taking programs on my computer, which I will or won't ever look at again. But it becomes a kind of personal reference library of concepts and so on, and then then you write from.
Yeah, the Bulgarian cigarettes bit is kind of revealing to me, because I find, just as a reader, that you don't want there to be too much detail, because that's, I mean, there's sort of the famous Elmore Leonard dictum. At one point, someone asked him, why are your books so, why does everybody love your books so much? And he said, well, I just leave out all the parts that people skip. That's why they're so good. And it's true that endless descriptions of decor and brands and things like that are inevitably going to clog up a story and make it harder to get through. And yet, so there's an economy that's necessary there. But if you screw up the couple things, or you decide to be explicit about, something that is irrelevant to character or to setting, and just include some random thing, it's almost worse, because that pulls the reader out of the story.
Well, and people write to you to tell you.
And they'll write you. Yes, they will write you. And this happens a lot in the States with weaponry. If you get the get the firearm wrong, or describe its use incorrectly, there will be readers who will find you and let you know.
Well, one of my cast iron rules is, when I'm writing into my own universes, is that I always make up the weaponry.
That's a good idea.
Because then nobody can argue with me about whether it has that kind of trigger pull or not. Nope, it absolutely does. That's just what it is. Yeah, no, exactly. I put an answering machine in this book, and immediately it comes back. People going, there weren't answering machines. Yes, there were. There were answering machines at that time, but they were very much a kind of elite toy. And yes, that person would have one, and whatever. But also,
bring it on, bring it on. I've done the
but then the other thing you have to do is explain to another part of your readership what an answering machine is.
Yeah,
because who knows what an answering machine is anymore?
Yeah,
no, exactly. So sometimes again, it's the bits of the stuff where you just got to skate very quickly over the shaky bits and just move on and let people absorb and go, that's actually not important enough for me to pick up on. It's just a piece of thing, and you just move on to the bit you want them seeing.
And I will say, I mean, this is coming into the espionage genre after having been inside the espionage business for a while, there's an obsession with authenticity in this genre that I find. I mean, look, I try to get a lot of stuff right. At the end of the day, it is the story, the story, the story, the story, the characters, the characters, the characters. The other stuff is cladding, right?
I mean, and this is the thing I specifically have to be wary of. People are now asking me the questions they used to ask my dad about spying. I do not know the answers. I have never been a spy. I was listening to myself on the radio the other day. Someone threw me one of those questions and I was struggling and I was talking absolute nonsense. And thank God at some point in that process, I was like, I mean, and we are talking about a fictional universe here. And I was like, oh, at least you did that much. Next time I get that question, I just have to be like, hey, I don't know, talk to David McCloskey,
Yeah, please don't send them my way. I was gonna lead off with a question here, Nick, about how AI is transforming MI6. Over to you, Nick.
How is AI transforming MI6? I imagine GCHQ, which is our signals intelligence. I imagine they're having a great time with AI. I would imagine they're slightly nervous right now about the fact that you can apparently use AI to compromise existing high security encryption.
Yeah,
but it's not like that's a surprise. Oh, sorry, it wasn't AI, it was quantum computing. But it's not like that's a surprise to anybody, right? Quantum computing has been, a thing that will do that for some years. So I would imagine, and there are already, ways of mathematics for dealing with that problem. So, how is AI? I have no clue. All I can tell you is that AI is profoundly good at certain tasks and profoundly bad at others. It's great at protein folding, and apparently it's very good at recognizing when elephants are crossing the road and would otherwise be run over by heavy goods vehicles. It is terrible at policing. It's very bad at policing. Do not let anybody tell you that law enforcement run by AI is a good plan. And it's terrible at writing creative work.
it is terrible at that. I've given it a few prompts. Yeah.
So let AI do protein folding because we all need better medicine. That's a great plan. And apparently let it look after elephants. It also, astonishingly, they've just done a program that they did a study which shows that it's very good at persuading people to reconsider factually incorrect beliefs.
Oh, probably well, we could use some of that, by the way.
Probably because it's not a person, so it's not arguing with you. It's just kind of a machine going, "Hey, you know what? That's nonsense." Anyway, I have a great deal of time for the deeper varieties of AI and some of the more interesting versions. I find the deployment of AI to write poetry is it's an attempt to hoodwink yourself with the frailty of the Turing test.
That's good. I'm gonna steal that.
There we go. Yeah, feel free.
The three-legged stool. I'm taking that line.
There we go. T-shirts. Okay, well, we got to wrap this up. We'll get in trouble.
We do.
Here we go.
We're supposed to remind everybody that they participated. The books are coming. The Carla's Choice book plate and the 7th floor signed copy will be delivered in 8 to 10 business days. And I think we both say thank you tremendously for joining us in this wonderfully semi-structured conversation.
And both Carla's Choice and 7th Floor are available 24/7 on barnesandnoble.com and at local Barnes and Noble stores, I believe.
That's right.
It says on my little sheet.
That is true.
And that's it. David, it's great talking to you. This is the first time we've met, by the way, everybody. So this was it's good to talk to you, and we should do this again, or we could even have a cup of coffee sometime.
Yes, I would love that. And this has been wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining. This was great. 2 authors talking unstructured, and I think 8 minutes late. I would call this landing the plane. I would say.
No, that's absolutely. Right. I think it's it. So now we have to find a graceful out. David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
And that's all from us.
Bye, everybody.